Well, thank you so much. I was having a lovely chat to Francis out the back. I didn't realise I was being introduced. So a delight to be here. And Francis was in the chair when I was over last week. I was doing a World Vision event at Parliament House, and it was lovely because Francis was the acting speaker that she welcomed me. So great to see you again, Francis. And I told the gathering last week that my presence in Adelaide before a grand final was a very good omen for the Crows. And I said that back in 1997, when I had been the mayor of St Kilda were playing the Crows in the grand final. And I did a press conference on the Friday before the grand final. And at that press conference, I thought I'd be a little bit humorous. It turned out to not be very funny. I said, look, I had a dream last night, so vivid, I have to talk to you about my dream. I saw people walking in total darkness, people whose lives were blighted and miserable because of utter darkness. And when I tried to work out why they lived in a land of darkness, I looked up toward the sun and saw its light had been totally blocked out by big flocks of ugly black crows. And I said, but there was good news. In my dream, a saint walked into this land. And these miserable people who'd only known darkness had light restored to them because the saint just opened his hand and the crows swept down and just ate out of his hand. I said, can anyone explain my dream? Nobody laughed. Nobody thought this was at all funny. They just were so focused on that premiership. And I said, and you won it. So me being here in grand final week must be a good omen, right? Wrong. So I'm sorry to say that all of Melbourne is rejoicing. And this town, this state, I'm sure is in misery, except for the Port Adelaide supporters who probably are rejoicing at your misery. But it was a great grand final if you're a Richmond person. I might just reflect on that. I got a couple of tickets for a couple of tragic Tiger fans, and I didn't go to the game myself, but watched it and took these friends to Swan Street, Richmond, which is the belly of the beast for Richmond supporters. My son has a charity, YGAP. It has a restaurant, Feast of Merit, that's right in the heart of Swan Street. And we had dinner there, and Mick Molloy arrived, and the crowds arrived, and it was going off. And I watched total strangers weeping and hugging and high-fiving and singing the Tiger song over and over and over. And I realised that in a secular culture, for many of these people, this was the meaning to their lives. It really was. This was the meaning to their lives. The joy, the exhilaration, the ecstasy, the euphoria, the community, the sense of purpose, the sense that vicariously, as a Tiger supporter, we have done this. And St. Dusty has led us to the promised land. Wait for the new rash of tattoos about to break out. Well, I was reflecting a bit on this. We do live in a secular culture which says, choose your own meaning, whatever you like. There's no accepted meaning, no given meaning, choose your own meaning. For many football fans, I watched them celebrating the meaning of their lives that night. There's a message in this culture that says, and by the way, you have a meaningless existence living in a meaningless universe. It's a pretty strong message in a secular culture. Richard Dawkins, when he wrote The Blind Watchmaker in 1986, Richard Dawkins of the New Atheist Society or movement, Dawkins and the Blind Watchmaker. And the preface said, "And for ever humans have agonized over the mystery of existence. In this book, you'll discover the mystery has been solved. The mystery of human existence has been solved. Through natural selection, the evolutionary process, we know that natural selection is about blind, pitiless indifference. There's no purpose. It's purely chance. It's random. It's survival of the fittest. There is no design. But blind, pitiless indifference has solved the mystery of existence." Well, thank you, Richard. What I've noticed is that in an increasingly secular society, most people don't feel their mystery has been solved. It doesn't actually feel solved. But when it says go and choose whatever meaning you have, we have a whole range of options, but they're sort of a little bit empty. They seem to trickle out largely into consumerism, largely into whatever experience actually makes me feel good. The values are live your dream, pursue your dream. What if your dream as a pedophile is actually sex with kids? What if your dream was like the Las Vegas shooter, Paddock? Pursuing your dreams once was never a sufficient answer. You needed a sense of purpose, constraint, guidance, something that was more solid than just pursuing your dreams. Well, I say all that because I don't know why I'm saying all that. That's not in my speech. But let me try and make a pretended connection to my speech. The speech title is "How Can We Build Stronger Communities with New Arrivals?" And it seems to me that one of the purposes, certainly the Christian faith give, is that we are made for community. That the most profound thing, if we say we are made in the image of God, is that God is a communitarian God. And therefore community and how we live in it is a reflection of the Godhead, of ultimate reality, of divine purpose, that is actually what we are made for. I think I said when I was speaking for Campbell in Auckland a few weeks ago, I'm often intrigued by that great academic film, Crocodile Dundee. There's Mick in a bar in New York, fascinated that every American he meets seems to have a counsellor and a therapist. And he says, a little bit puzzled, "What's the matter with you people? Don't you have mates?" And the American says, if you don't have therapists and counsellors in Australia, how do you solve your problems? And Mick said, "Oh, it's pretty easy. You go to the pub in Walkabout Creek where I live. Wally's behind the bar. You'd end up telling Wally your problem. Wally ends up sharing it with the whole bar. Soon no more problem." Now, it's a terrible counselling technique, but there is a germ of truth. The germ of truth is that we know most of our problems are relational. We have been hurt by significant others that matter to us, and we know that most of life is about peer admiration, family admiration, colleague admiration, that most of the consumer journey is really about, look what I drive, look what the postcode I live in, look at the school my kids go, therefore I'm making something of my life, therefore I deserve admiration. We know it's driven by community need. We certainly know, in Mick Dundee's language, that good counsellors don't solve your problems. They listen in depth and they say, "You're hurting. Do you need to forgive? Do you need to confront? Have you done everything possible and you need to draw a line in the sand and move on and find a way to heal the hemorrhaging?" The good counsellors listen, but we know you can't replace enough counsellors for fragmenting communities. You actually need communities where there is healthy relationship and identity and connection and empathy. Well, building stronger communities with new arrivals is my topic. Is that the topic I was given? Good, I just made sure I pulled out the right speech. And that starts really with empathy. Antonio Guterres, the now he was the UNHCR Commissioner for Refugees. He's now the Secretary General of the UN. He's got the top job. He said, while every refugee's story is different and their anguish personal, they all share a common thread of uncommon courage. The courage not only to survive, but to persevere and rebuild their shattered lives. He might have added, and they need to do that in community. If we're made for community, you can only rebuild lives with a sense of community, reflecting back like a mirror to say, you matter, we care, you're doing okay, what are you struggling with? Community is literally the divine incubator reflected on earth that we say makes up ultimate reality. Well, we have a great challenge. 1 in every 113 people in the world is a refugee. It's huge numbers, isn't it? 1 in every 113 people. Australia, and Julie Bishop likes to boast about this, has resettled more than 870,000 refugees since World War II. I'll talk about northern Uganda, Bidi, South Sudanese refugees fleeing, where I've been this year. They've resettled 1 million refugees from South Sudan in the last 12 months. Australia's boast about 870,000 since the end of the Second World War starts to look a bit hollow. And that's before I talk about Jordan and Lebanon, Turkey and so many other places with so many refugees. But in the past 10 years, Australia has only accounted for 0.99% of global total refugees. That makes Australia 25th overall for contribution of resettling and accepting refugees. If you look at share of burden, proportion to population and GDP, we actually are way down the list. We come in about 91. Not much to boast about in terms of being generous. And yet, we know in Australia we're all immigrants. We're all either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And our greatness actually comes from that fact. A quarter of Australians who are born overseas, 49% have a parent born overseas. More than a third of chief executives of the ASX Stock Exchange 100 companies are foreign born. A third. The proportion of Australians who were born overseas has hit its highest point in over 120 years, with 28% of Australians' population born overseas, according to ABS. Throughout its history as a nation, we have said immigration is the cornerstone, the foundation stone. It is fundamental to who we are. So of all nations to be having a paralysing 15-year toxic debate about boat people that has really damaged the Australian soul, this is perplexing. We are an immigrant nation. It is the cornerstone. We know that our complex and ambivalent attitude to migration in general and refugees in particular is something of a blind spot. It's often very easy, nonetheless right, to point to the blind spot of Americans with their guns. There's Donald Trump, who says Paddock, the killer, was just an evil, sick, demented person. But we're not going to politicise this event. Mind you, every time there's an Islamic atrocity in another country, Trump tweets immediately to politicise it, but we're not allowed to politicise it because it's one of our own. And the NRA actually control Republican congressmen, either through bribes or intimidation. We're not allowed to politicise and have a discussion. When is it possible, by the way, if not after the biggest massacre ever, to have a discussion about guns? Well, we're very clear about the US. The US might actually look at us and our refugee policy. I have to say that in the revealed transcript of the Malcolm Turnbull-Donald Trump interview, for the first time, I found myself curiously on Donald Trump's side. There is Malcolm saying, even if they're a Nobel Peace Prize winner, they can't come here. They're not bad people, they're good people. And Donald said, pretty matter-of-factly, well, if they're good people, why don't you take them? Not a bad point, Donald. Not a bad point. This blind spot with us is quite extraordinary, given it's been a foundation history. Now, I'm not suggesting we can take everyone. I'm not suggesting open borders. I'm not suggesting that that's a solution. But when you actually understand our ambiguous, complex relationship, the fact that it produces such extraordinary emotion and fear and hysteria within the Australian soul, built on immigration and refugees, is quite extraordinary. We know that migration, long established, rational and successful in this country, has helped build a very successful multicultural policy. It is quite different here to Europe. European national identities formed after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, when the nation state was really born, needed a cultural narrative to explain the nation state. So now there's a thing called Germany and France. Before it was just empires. What are Germans like? What are French like? A whole cultural story built up about what they're like. I studied in Switzerland, did my theology there. The running joke in Switzerland when I first arrived was, what's the definition of heaven? Heaven is a Swiss banker, a German mechanic, a French cook, and an Italian lover. What's the definition of hell? Hell is a German cook, an Italian banker, a French, what have I forgotten? Something or other, mechanic, and I've lost the joke, but you get the drift. You get the drift. In other words, there were very particular national types because you had to tell a national story to build national identity because the nation state had just been formed. It's why in Germany and France it's really hard to say a Turkish German and a Turkish Frenchman. It doesn't fit what is a history of what it means to be French and German. Both America and Australia have no problem with hyphenated existences. Chinese Australians, Vietnamese Australians, Italian Australians, Turkish Australians, because we were settled well after as multicultural societies, and we have largely proved to be very successful multicultural societies. Well, I'm really suggesting that to be successful, you need proper funding to build community, proper support, certainly much greater levels of aid and for refugees, and a quota on refugees and immigration that needs to be much more generous. We know that by and large in Australia, grassroots movements, we've seen this particularly in country towns, are very welcoming of refugees. Actually take great pride because they know some of their own story in integrating them. This is how we're made as humans, to help, to empathise, to serve, to build community, to walk alongside. It's actually much more deeper in our DNA, our Christian faith would teach us, than saying, I'll just climb my ladder. I have no responsibilities for others. That leads to depression and brittleness. Actually serving and giving is the way we find our humanity, find out our true meaning. Scott Higgins recently published a book, Boundless Planes to Share. he points out that Australia is a swirling mass at the moment of contradiction, fear and hope when it comes to refugees. Our status as the only island continent nation on earth, far removed from the world's conflict hotspots, means that we get a leave pass with very few refugees coming to our doors. Probably New Zealand's the only other country that gets a bigger leave pass. New Zealand's policy for blocking refugees is called Australia. They arrive here first. But surrounded by sea is a luxury the rest of the world doesn't have. They have land boundaries. They actually understand that this isn't a luxury to get across the Mediterranean's a few kilometres compared to getting to Australia. Higgins says our public discourse is characterised by half-truths, misconceptions, outright falsehoods. We have learned to fear asylum seekers and refugees. He said the public discourse around refugees would be different if we were prepared just to start listening to their stories. Listening is what builds community. It's what a counsellor does when they know your relationships are hurting. Stories bring us out of the clouds of abstraction, ideology, mythology, and politicking to the realities of life. We all know, well, we don't sing it, but we at least know one line of the second verse of our national anthem. For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage, let us all combine to advance Australia fair. The song, composed by Scottish-born Peter Dodds McCormick, a migrant, apart from our nation's Indigenous people, we are all in that song. That's why it should be in the first stanza and we should all know it. We are all immigrants. We're all descendants of immigrants. It's our song. Much of Australia's greatness comes from that fact. The reality that Australians, via trade, migration, exchange of technology, tourism, and our personal friendships with those in other nations, our support of international charities, want to engage with the world. Being just an island nation and pulling up the drawbridge, we know, actually doesn't enliven us as a great nation. Well, our history is utterly dependent on external exchanges. The Trauma and Grief Network states that resettlement provides refugees with the opportunity to start a new life in a country where they will be safe. However, it also brings with it lots of challenges and adversities that may impact on children and families. Some of the responses seen from younger children include separation anxiety, difficulty in forming friendships and social relationships, and developmental difficulties. Young people in refugee communities often present a higher risk of suicidal behaviour than their peers from non-refugee backgrounds. It's never easy to actually come and start again. Department of Immigration stats show people who travel to Australia by boat without a valid visa seeking asylum are more likely to be genuine refugees than people who travel by air with a visa and seek asylum on arrival. Over the years, between 70 and 100% of people arriving by boat have been assessed for eligible for refugee protection. This is why Peter Dutton's statement was so appalling about leaving their Armani goods on Manus to go to America. No, Peter, they have been found to be refugees fleeing persecution, and that's how you dismiss them. People from Afghanistan have been the most likely to seek asylum in Australia by boat for many years. In this group, between 2008 and 2013, upwards of 95% were found to be refugees and granted protection visas, 95%. And I had a reflection on us when I was in the camps outside Mosul. World Vision, working in those camps, desperate people fleeing, kids traumatised, can speak, weren't speaking because they'd seen beheadings and crucifixions, being loved back into speaking through drama and dance by our World Vision workers. Just a confidence that there are good people in life. There isn't evil and arbitrary cruelty in life. Mosul is a very sophisticated city. I was staying in Erbil, just an hour's drive, and Dahuk, a 40 minutes drive. cafe culture, great freeways, great hospitals. I never thought it, first time in Iraq, I was there 6 months ago. I had never realised how sophisticated these cities were. For the residents of Mosul to be in tents and fleeing would be as shocking as if ISIS took over Adelaide. And you were all in tents, refugee camps, depending on... It made me think, I really hope with our refugee policy there isn't tyranny, whether it's an ISIS form or another, that happens here. Where would we flee? Where would we flee? That's what persecution actually means. Now, most of those Mosul refugees only want to go back, 99.9%. It's about 0.1% who actually cannot go back for religious persecution or ethnic or political persecution reasons. Well, a Refugee Council report stated many of those seeking safety in Australia have been told they would now always live in limbo, limiting the hope of ever reuniting with their families, and denied the chance to truly call Australia home. The report stated, people seeking asylum face many challenges. Some have no income, most have very little. It is this group of individuals and families who are skipping meals, living in crowded houses to try and have some money for food, difficulties in accessing services. Until recently, most couldn't work or study. Well, this is the group who've been living in the margins, vulnerable to exploitation and to misery. Some lawyers reported that clients have been too hungry to give them instructions, people who couldn't afford to travel to get to access services, even apply for jobs. Against this is the great contribution of refugees. Research on refugees found that once they've had the opportunity to establish themselves, they make a profoundly important economic, civil and social contribution to Australian society. A few years ago, a study commissioned by the Department of Immigration, conducted by the University of Adelaide, looked at the economic and social contributions refugees have made to Australia. The report found that while refugees face many barriers, they overwhelmingly contribute positively to Australian societies. Many settle in non-metropolitan areas that create social and economic benefits for regional communities. Refugees help meet labour shortages, particularly in low-skilled, low-paid occupations. They display strong entrepreneurial qualities. Most refugees and their children show considerable achievement and contribution during their working lives. Most refugees make significant contributions through volunteering that benefits the wider community. Well, SBS reported a few months ago that a 3-year pilot program which offers support to refugees is helping them to move off Centrelink payments to start their own businesses. The economic benefit of refugee entrepreneurs to Australia has been valued in the millions of dollars, according to a report by Settlement Services International. 68% of the participants successfully established a business while participating in the program. They paid company tax and generated new jobs. These are people who didn't come on skilled migrant visas. I must say I do have a problem with skilled migrant visas. Where World Vision works, poor countries pay the education of doctors and sometimes as other skilled people, only for the brain drain of us to cherry pick those people. Can't blame them. Greater standard of living here. Refugees, it was found, didn't come on skilled migration visas, but protection visas, but very quickly were able to stand on their own feet and contribute back economically. Most had been here for 3 years. Some had been here for just 12 months in that study of entrepreneurs. According to a recent University of Melbourne study, Australians wrongly believe asylum seekers and refugees in this country are given upon arrival a $10,000 lump sum, Nike shoes and preferential treatment for public housing. The study revealed many people concerned about Islamization of Australia were unshakably convinced Muslims were universally overpowering Christian traditions, such as Christmas cards and singing of carols in schools. Let me tell you, it's secular people who don't like the Christmas carols. Muslims, by and large, say, absolutely. This is one of the surprising things about World Vision. Our Muslim staff, because we work from Iraq to Afghanistan to Syria to many West African countries, so we employ Muslim staff as a Christian organisation. The Muslim staff are the ones who actually are the most insistent that we take our Christian faith seriously, that we take our devotions and our prayer seriously. When secular agencies sort of convince the Australian public that secular is normal, let me tell you, in the developing world, they go, secular? How do you name a child? How do you have a wedding? If you're secular, you don't have a culture. We know Christians, we trust them. Is there in Muslim majority countries? We get it all the wrong way around often. Well, the myth that waves of Muslims are entering the country as refugees, threatening to turn us into a Muslim country, or creating a minority whose values are incompatible, is a very strong myth. A 2014 poll showed Australians on average estimate Muslims make up 18% of the Australian population. According to the census, they make up 2.2%. It's amazing the gap in perceptions, isn't it? By 2050, according to the Pew Forum and demographic analysis, in Australia, the Muslim population will grow to 4.9%. Yet most believe it's already 18%, and we are overrun. The University of Melbourne researchers said, based on previous opinion polls, voters who held strongly negative views on asylum seekers far outnumbered those with strongly positive views, and the Australian public supports the Turnbull and the Labor Party's tough stance on unauthorised boat arrivals. Well, there's a lot of this stuff that you will know and understand, but I think we actually have to remember that messages, political messages, are often driven by fear of the other. We know, and H.G. Mencken, who is the great writer in America, said, by and large, the job of politics is to create fear. He's a satirist, and he said, when the populace is alarmed, they will be clamorous to be led to safety by menacing the people with endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. This is how politicians will rule. Let me, in just seeking to finish up, say that I think one of the challenges for us as Christians is to think about where our loyalties lie. If I put two words to you, Australian or Christian, which word would you put first? If we put the word Australian before Christian, it suggests our security, our needs should come first. As a loyal Australian, isn't Australia my first loyalty? But if I put the word Christian first, I say that all people are made in the image of God. Human rights, ultimately, universal and indivisible, need a foundation that I believe is sacred. That we believe all children are made in the image of God. That national rights cannot trump human rights. The whole movement of human rights was to actually really build off that statement, all are made in the image of God, to trump national rights. I was at the G20 in Hamburg. I was quite interested because there was Trump, we'll make America great again. Putin, we'll make Mother Russia great again. Erdogan had popped in. He'll make Turkey great again, and he's putting tens of thousands of journalists in prison, as you know, brought down martial law. Being in Germany, I thought you would never hear a German chancellor say, "We will make Germany great again." Why? Because the population would hear Adolf Hitler's voice. This is the great challenge with putting national rights before human rights. And Christian faith from the beginning has been the first global Christian faith. It said the slave, the woman, the poor in a Greco-Roman world carry the image of God. This is what was truly novel and groundbreaking about Christian faith. It's why the early Christians cared in education and health, not just for their own Christians, but the poor, the slaves, the Greco-Roman poor, because there was no ethic of caring for them. They weren't equal. They didn't, in Greco-Roman gods and religion, carry the image of God. So, when we think about loyalties in Australia, we have to think about slashing our aid levels to its lowest level ever, 0.22%, giving ourselves a leave pass when other nations have legislated the promise we made, and they made, of 0.7%. It's legislated in Britain, Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries. Some are higher than 0.7%. We, the third richest nation per capita on earth, have slashed it to 0.22. It was highest, by the way, under Bob Menzies. Aid was never a left-right issue. It was bipartisan. We knew we were blessed. If you're going to deal with 65 million refugees in the world and give them hope that when the war stops they can go back, you've got to increase aid levels or keep your aid levels. When the UN Cash for Work program in the camps in Jordan and Syria was cut from $30 a month to $13.50 a month because countries like Australia and others had cut aid, 1 million started crossing the Mediterranean to go to Germany and Europe. They couldn't live on $13.50 a month. Could you? When you cut aid, as we've done, you get movements of desperate people. When you give them hope with aid levels, you actually stabilise your own countries and potentially that flow, because most do just want to go back. Well, in Australia, my first loyalty is not to Australia, but to humanity. Not the Australia that rejects the refugee and keeps them in offshore detention, not the Australia that demonises homeless and poor, or even those of different religious persuasions. If we believe in Christian faith, human rights, we have to say that trumps national rights. The great Michael Leunig had a cartoon recently. In the first frame, it was titled The Old Australia. There's a bloke smiling and saying, "No worries, mate." In the second frame, it's titled The New Australia. This bloke's now looking worried, and he's reading a sign that says, "Be worried. You are not safe. Enemies, germs, evil, your government is protecting you." This message of fear is the opposite of faith. It's the opposite of faith. Well, in Bidi Bidi, and let me finish there, where there's 2,000 refugees arriving a day. It's in northern Uganda, fleeing famine in war-torn South Sudan. 60% of the people fleeing are kids, often unaccompanied, told by their parents, follow the neighbours, follow the column of suffering humanity. Just walk. Days confused with nothing, walking 3, 4, 5 days, getting their first hot meal from World Vision when they arrive in Uganda. What really moved me about Uganda, and I've talked to their leaders, is they haven't closed their borders. What's more, every refugee, after being processed and giving them a card, is given 30 by 30 metres of land in Uganda. World Vision gives them the tools so they can start vegetable gardens and the materials to make a house. And those refugees can live next door to Ugandans, go to Ugandan schools, Ugandan health centres, and they're really poor in North Uganda and overcrowded. They have exactly the same rights as Ugandans except the right to vote. And when I talk to the Ugandan leaders, how they haven't closed the border, how they're so generous, how it's taking an incredible economic toll on a poor nation, why they haven't closed the borders, why do they do this? You know what they say? Because we were once refugees under Idi Amin and the Lord's Resistance Army, which was there in the north of Uganda. This is empathy that goes right to the heart of Christian faith. This is the first church where Christians cared for the poor who weren't Christian. That's why the good news spread so powerfully, turning the known world upside down. It was unprecedented. It was remarkable. This sense of empathy is incredibly important today. So I want to just say in the work of the church at the moment, and boy do we have a job to do to restore trust as an institution. I like to say I still believe, but it sometimes feels like whistling a bit in the wind. Australians haven't given up on the product, Jesus. They've just given up on the retail outlet, the church. The Essential poll out from The Guardian just this week named 15 of our top institutions and Australians' trust in them. Coming in top, trust at 71%, surprised me, was Australian Federal Police. Coming in lowest, equal lowest, was trade unions, politicians and the church. For the church, trust had declined from 30% of the public trusting us in 2015 to today, 2017, 26%. Well, this is really worrying. But having said that, I had this experience with the Royal Commission. They invited me in to speak to their 200 staff after Easter. And they said, come and give us some hope. We've been buried in muck of sexual abuse. I walked in, I could feel the hostility in the room. Couldn't blame them. I'd seen churches deceive and move and often lie, not protect children. And I could feel the secular hostility. And I pushed back. I said, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I said, faith is incredibly important for creating community, creating family. Look at the volunteering and giving statistics in Australia, and it's extraordinary, the high proportion from Christians who volunteer and who give, much higher than the secular Australia. I said a statistic that surprised them. It might surprise you. Of the 25 biggest charities in Australia, 23 are Christian faith-based. Salvo's is one of them. Of the 25 biggest charities in America, only 10 are Christian faith-based. Of the 25 biggest charities in Britain, only 3 are Christian faith-based. It's quite extraordinary, the heavy lifting in Australia, secular Australia, done by Christian charities and work. Well, faith doesn't mean having all the answers. I said this to the Royal Commission as I found the mood turn, where they started to say, you're right, we don't want the Christian faith damaged. We want that glue and motivation and community building that it does. We need it. Found that mood shift. Faith doesn't mean having all the answers. Only fanatics and bigots seem to have no doubts. Faith is not a fact to be possessed. Faith is a confidence to be advanced and developed. There is an ultimate reality, God, who gives us purpose, who is communal, who calls us to build community. There is a direct correlation between having occasions of doubt that raise hard questions and development of the confidence that the Bible calls faith. Faith is a trust that our lives are more than accident, that we have purpose and individual significance, that everything we do has a meaning. It's being aware of the sacred element in every aspect of life. So I finish with saying I admire the work the Salvation Army do. I admire the extraordinary glue that you are in this nation. And I pray that your commitment to building communities that welcome refugees will continue. Thank you.